Planet Earth is covered with life, but none has had a more profound impact than humans. We aren't the oldest, most numerous, or even the most widespread species, but we are unique. We've managed to take control of our own fate, and that of the entire planet. We were created by the same natural forces that shaped all life, but we are no longer living in nature. Unlike all other known forms of life, we've gained enough consciousness to think about nature and our relationship to it. But first, in order to talk about nature, we need an objective definition. I like this one. Nature is the laws of physics, chemistry, and emergent phenomena. It's life on autopilot. Nature is the spontaneous creation of self-replicating proteins. Organisms are merely avatars for these proteins to reproduce. Nature doesn't care about meaning or morals. Like gravity or protons, it simply exists. All life, including humans, has been honed by billions of years of evolution to do one thing: reproduce. For humans, that meant selecting for increasing intelligence and eventually consciousness. The pleasures and pains used to drive animal behavior became forces for us to control. Our increasingly complex social lives spawned morals and the search for meaning, and attaching value to inherently meaningless events. We began to think about our world and created culture to understand our place in it. As we became aware of ourselves, we placed ever greater value on the search for meaning and purpose beyond reproduction. This is something totally foreign to all other life forms. We wanted a legacy, to build something bigger than ourselves. For as long as we've been human, we've worked to escape the natural world. Our technologies, knowledge, and even our cooperation allow us to alter and experience the environment in vastly different ways than even our closest relatives. At first, the battle to escape nature was mostly unconscious, but as our knowledge and awareness grew, so did our efforts to escape our natural limitations. But change is never unresisted. There's always been a tension between technological progress and those claiming that an older, more natural way is better. Broadly speaking, we can represent this by showing two opposing extremes. The primitive worldview, which is represented by the most radical forms of romantic environmentalism. The main claim of the primitive worldview is that leaving nature is a bad idea. People who follow this view tend to idolize hunter-gatherer and indigenous cultures as ideal ways of living. They usually personify nature as a compassionate giver or mother that must be protected from the ravages of man. On the other side, we have the modernist worldview, which seeks to control nature to serve the interests of mankind. To the modernist, life is merely genetic code obeying the laws of physics. There's nothing sacred about it. The modernist views nature as ambivalent at best and actively hostile to human flourishing at worst. With their newfound consciousness, the modernists can clearly see that nature doesn't care about the voice in our heads that we call me. Understanding what relationship we should have with the natural world, if any, has always been a hotly debated issue. What seems like a philosophical question can have incredibly high stakes. The future of our species depends on how we choose to view nature and our relationship with it. So which worldview is right? These examples are deliberately extreme, but we can use them to find objective truth. Let's break it down. We already have our definition of nature, but what really happens in the natural world? When we think of nature, we think of beautiful landscapes and all the incredible forms of life that call this planet home. For an outside observer with material needs attended to, nature is indeed beautiful, but beauty is not truth. What ignorance calls beauty is often brutality and horror. The birds are not singing, they're shrieking war cries. What seems to be a peaceful meadow is really a bloody battlefield. On every square inch of land and sea, organisms are fighting and killing. They try desperately to outcompete each other for food and resources, and for a shot at reproduction. Most of them will fail. They will die gruesome deaths from disease, starvation, parasites, and predators. From the very bottom of the food chain to the top, suffering and death is the norm in nature. Look at the typical life of a given animal. If its parents manage to survive long enough to reproduce, it might be born. Depending on the species, it'll most likely be eaten alive long before it reaches maturity. If it manages to avoid predators, its siblings may outcompete it or bully it to death. Or its parents may be killed and it will starve. Throughout its life, it will be infected with parasites that sap its strength and cause it pain. If our unfortunate animal is not at the top of the food chain, its life will most likely end by being eaten alive. Even if it miraculously survives until old age, eventually an injury or lack of food will leave it dying alone in agony to be devoured by scavengers. If an animal happens to be at the top of the food chain, its fate is hardly better. An apex predator can still be killed by rivals or succumb to disease and injury. The predator that lives to old age will one day find itself too weak to hunt. Its fate will be to starve to death over several weeks if it's not eaten first. The day-to-day battle for survival in nature is absolutely brutal, and it's one that all but the most destitute of humans have forgotten about. In the developed world and large parts of the developing world, most of us are far from a state of nature. If you're able to watch this YouTube video, I can guarantee you are. We have exterminated the large predators that would harm us, eradicated most diseases and parasites that would kill us, and have built vast infrastructure to make our lives easier. Food is plentiful and can be found everywhere. The difference between walking over a paved bridge and trying to navigate a swamp is almost incalculable. Indeed, even the homeless living in our cities are not living in a state of nature. They are living in an environment dominated, controlled by, and influenced by man to make his life easier in every way imaginable. Humans often make the silly mistake of anthropomorphizing the non-human, and nature is no exception. Nature is given the personification of a mother. Nature is seen to be caring, loving, and wholesome. If we live in harmony with nature, she will provide. But this view is just as ridiculous as believing Zeus makes thunder. At its base, all nature consists of is self-replicating proteins that don't care about anything. These proteins aren't even alive as we would define it. Like water flowing downhill, they obey simple rules and their only function is self-replication. We living organisms, from bacteria to humans, are merely the emergent phenomena that are the result of that process. Self-replicating proteins are us, but they don't care about us. Much of the suffering we face in our lives comes from our own genetic faults and inherent biological weakness. Do you have a serious chronic illness or disability? In a state of nature, you would probably be dead, and evolution would keep on humming. Natural selection is a brutal, cruel process. From a cold scientific perspective, it's impressive, and even beautiful, but trust me, you really, really don't want to be a part of it. The only thing natural selection is concerned with is reproduction, so anything that facilitates this is good. This is how you get the Barabusa, a wild pig whose tusks have evolved to grow up through its own skull, and if they grow too long, will curl back and puncture its skull again, all just to attract a mate. Chronic suffering of every kind, mental illness, disease, cancer, pain, parasites, these are all natural. They are products of life and evolution. When we think of nature, we think of pretty forests and ignore all the terrible things that are natural. When you go camping, you're not in nature. You're a foreign tourist who gets to enjoy the fun, but never has to deal with the horrors of being a full-time resident in nature. Nature is impersonal and has no concern for perfection or human welfare. Many of the traits humans have are great for reproduction but cause pain and suffering as we age. Many more of the traits we have would cause us to die if we were living in a state of nature. Today, billions of humans are alive because we defied nature. Most people you know get to live long lives of relative comfort because we choose to say fuck you to nature. The romantic activist may insist that we should live in harmony with nature instead of trying to control it. Harmony with nature means the sick and the weak, the elderly and the injured, die agonizing deaths like every other animal in nature. Nature is not sacred. How do you feel about rocks? Rocks are cool, but they're obviously not alive. If there were rocks in the way of you trying to dig a well, you'd move them. No one would say you were evil for trying to stop a rock slide with engineering. What about nature? You already know that all life is at its base simple self-replicating proteins that aren't alive any more than rocks are. You and I are a happy accident, a coincidence. We arose from emergent phenomena of impersonal systems and chance interacting over billions of years. You can't desecrate nature unless you worship nature. Believing in a personified nature, in a Mother Earth, is a spiritual, not a scientific claim. This is fine, but you can't turn around and try to use science to defend your position. If you want to take the spiritual view of nature, think long and hard. Your deity would be cruel, a lover of suffering and pain. If you want to worship nature, you should not be watching this video or enjoying any of the fruits of civilization. You should be living in a forest in a hunter-gatherer tribe with only the most rudimentary technology. You should be happy to practice cannibalism, infanticide, murder, rape, and all kinds of other fun, natural things. After all, that's how our natural ancestors lived, and how many uncontacted tribes still do. Beware those who claim that there are crimes or sins that can be committed against nature, for he is preaching a religion. Of course, for those of us living in reality, we know that we are already far away from nature that made us. We live in a world we made for ourselves. No sane person complains about indoor plumbing, electricity, medical care, food access, etc. These things aren't natural. To reject them means death and suffering for billions. To be fair, pursuing a separation from nature also has consequences. Only the foolish would deny our impacts on the rest of the natural world. Perhaps these impacts are even senseless and self-destructive, as environmentalists argue. But to discuss impacts at all, we must do so in a rational and objective way. Knowing that nature at its core is an impersonal force, you can't make moral arguments for it. Saying we should protect nature is a contradiction. Nature is not in any danger. We need to protect ourselves from nature. Individual species come and go, and this planet will be filled with death and suffering whether we are here or not to observe it. Building an industrialized civilization uses vast quantities of resources and energy. Industrialization means more humans get to exist, and that their lives are infinitely better than if they were still living as hunter-gatherers. But for this civilization to exist, much of nature must be sacrificed. There are always painful trade-offs that we need to honestly look at. You can't have it all. Every acre of farmland that guarantees human food security means less habitat for wildlife. Our prosperity means the decline and extinction of thousands of other species. This is inevitable. Anyone who says otherwise is selling something. To live within the confines of nature gives other life forms a chance, but destroys the hopes of a long-term, thriving, human civilization. In reality, there are only trade-offs, preferences in aesthetics, and costs. One thing that we can all agree on is that our current position is unsustainable. We are now powerful enough to destroy ourselves, but not powerful enough to ensure our long-term survival. We can mine mountains, but we can't mine asteroids. We can colonize smaller nations, but not planets. We can prolong death, but we can't cure it. We have widespread nuclear weapons, but limited nuclear power. You get the picture. Our current level of development provides ample opportunities for us to go extinct, but doesn't take us where we need to go. Thinking that we can keep the status quo by buying organic and slapping a few solar panels on our roof is delusional. Although that's what the mainstream believes, it's just hiding your head in the sand and waiting for your inevitable doom. We basically have two options. Option 1. Reject modernity and return to a primitive way of life. Watch our civilization slowly slide back to a more natural world as we exhaust our planet's natural resources, run out of energy, and squander even more resources on war. Or if you're a primitivist, you could voluntarily check out from the modern world and even try to force everyone along with you. Once we've achieved harmony with nature, we get to sit around for maybe a few 100,000 years until an asteroid, earthquake, or supervolcano eruption wipes us out for good. Option 2 is to completely break away from nature. All technological progress up until now has just been half measures. It's time to step on the gas and spread human life throughout the galaxy. This means radical genetic manipulation of ourselves and our food. It means nuclear power and eventually nuclear fusion. It means transhumanism and maybe even mortality. Space colonization, asteroid mining, and partial Dyson spheres. This is humanity becoming so powerful that we could essentially exist in one form or another until the end of the universe. We have to make a choice, and the choice is between a philosophy of acceptance and inevitable death, or a philosophy of change and hope. I've tried to make the case that nature is an impersonal force, not an anthropomorphic deity. As such, it has no interest that we need to consider when choosing our future. It's always been indifferent to our needs or desires and actively harms us and every other living thing in too many ways to count. This really leaves anyone who wants a long-term, prosperous future for our species with one choice. It's time to leave the cradle and leave nature behind. Sure, we can still visit and enjoy it. We can view it like a loving gardener views his plants. We know what's going on and we can participate when we like, but we are not a part of it. We can become masters of our own destiny. I don't think there's anything else a self-aware, intelligent species can do. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the first of what I hope is many new videos here at Ponder on That. If you'd like to see the article version of this video, or the many different articles that I will write and not make YouTube videos for, check out ponderonthat.com. I really hope you enjoyed this video and at least got something out of it, even if you disagree. If you found it useful, interesting, thought-provoking, or even annoying, please consider helping the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing with your friends. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you in the next one.